Hello, everyone. I want to do a quick, well, hopefully quick, kind of introduction to some of the aspects of poetry or poetics. I won't be going too far into the genre because it's actually a very old, very complicated, very technical genre, but it does have some kind of foundational ideas and categories that I want to point out to hopefully kind of demystify the process for you. A lot of people think of poetry as being difficult and obtuse and hard to understand, or even written such that it's hard to understand. In some cases, I think that's kind of true, but for the most part, I don't think that's what poetry is or what it should aspire to be. Um, the word poetry itself, just to kind of point this out, comes from this word poesis. I'll write this out. Poesis. It can mean poetry as we commonly have it. It also has this aspect of work, the idea of work. So even in the etymology of poetry itself, there is this concept of, well, it's tough. All things that uh, worth doing are worth doing well because, well, they require work and sedulous activity. One of the main differences between poetry and fiction, I think, is this concept of dimensions. Okay, we have to think of poetry in more dimensions than we would think of fiction, for example. I just threw this up here. For example, like in string theory, I think it used to be 23 dimensions they were hypothesizing. Now they've trimmed it down to merely 11 dimensions in string theory. But it's kind of an interesting metaphor to think about poetry. Fiction, for example, is more or less locked into space and time because fiction is telling a story where this happens, then this happens, right? Poetry is not locked into the same narrative structure as fiction is. Now, as we talked about in fiction, you can, of course, you can go out of order as they happen, right? So if we think of the fabula, right, how things happen, the actual chronology of things versus the sujet, which is how they're presented in the story itself, there's that distinction. But notice that it's still the same sequence of events, okay? Whereas poetry does not have to exist in those same dimensions. So in poetry, we think of things like line, image, meter, the visual aspects on the page, the sound effects in the poem, the function of punctuation, things like allusion or theme, right? And there's all kinds of subgenres in poetry itself. And this goes from what we call lyric poetry, which is more or less what we are going to look at for this class. But there are other types of poetry, and there are even subcategories within lyric poetry, like pastoral, for example, elegy, just uh, occasional poems. There's all kinds of different expressions of lyric poetry. There's epic poetry. So there's a lot of different kind of subgenres within poetry itself. Some more recent versions are slam poetry, spoken word poetry. There's even something called visual poetry, which I still am trying to figure out what that means. There's another one, a kind of fun one called concrete poetry. This goes back actually for about 400 years. 300, sorry. This poem by Ronald Johnson is a modern one from the 20th century. Now notice here in the concrete poem, he takes the words wind and wing and typographically mashes them together on the page. Okay, so what you see here, and actually if on the printed page, it's a little bit clearer. My handwriting here is not great, but it forms this kind of arc, or, well, a double V, you might say. as if a bird's wing. So this combination of wind and wing, right, gives us this bird image. But notice this, that we can't really read this poem out loud. We can see it, right? We can see its sort of visual image, but it resists reading. So here, for example, we would look at the image aspect, the visual aspect, maybe the illusion aspect or thematic aspect, but we can't really read it out loud. So certain poems lack certain aspects certain dimensions, because the author wants to play around with how the poem looks, how the poem, what its visual aspects are. Now, for this class, as I've said, but I like this quote, and I usually bring it up in class. I am not approaching poetry or fiction through literary theory. And actually, it was funny, when I taught this class last semester, I said that to the students out loud, and a couple of my English majors breathed a sigh of relief. They said, oh, thank goodness. Oh, I'm so tired of literary theory. Now, literary theory, if you are an English major, is necessary. You do have to study it. You do have to understand them. There are actually quite a few now. But as writers, I don't think that approaching poetry or fiction or any creative writing genre, I don't think that approaching them from a literary theory point of view is necessarily helpful. And it brings me to this nice quote. I actually figured this out. You can actually type in text on this little whiteboard. So in certain cases here, you won't have to read my terrible handwriting. How nice is that? But this comes from John Gardner. Now, I've put some of his chapters up on Moodle for you. Please read them. This comes from his book about fiction writing. Now, he has several, and it's very readable. It's very intelligent. It's very funny. And I think it's the best book on fiction writing that I've ever read. I teach it almost every semester. Even though we're doing poetry, I just wanted to mention this because I think this quote regarding literary criticism is kind of funny. He says, like any other discipline, philosophy, and I added this next part, and literary criticism, is apt to be inbred, concerned about questions that any normal human being would find transparently ridiculous. If one reads major journals on aesthetics, for instance, one cannot help but notice that most of the people who write about the arts seem never to have noticed how the arts really work. And there's a certain truth in that. Because as writers, we have to see the whole process. And I've mentioned this word before with fiction. We have to see everything as a techne. Okay? Now, techne it means craft in the Greek. It's more like an artisan's craft, right? Like somebody making mugs or bowls or whatever. And that's not to say that the mug or bowl has to be beautiful per se, but you get better at doing that the more you practice it, okay? You can read all of the theory, let's say we had a book called The Theory of Mugs, and you read that and you think, oh, okay, now I know everything about mugs, but when you go to actually build one, you might find, or sculpt one, or on a potter's wheel or whatever, you'll find that, wow, it's actually a lot harder than I thought. The book on The Theory of Mugs didn't quite tell me how to do it, okay? So just like literary criticism is important, it doesn't necessarily tell us how to write a poem or how to write a story, okay? It tells us ways of interpreting or seeing that thing, but it doesn't necessarily tell us how to do it. So I actually typed these out so you don't have to read my awful handwriting. It kind of actually types them out in a handwriting-esque font. I don't know how to change that. It's actually kind of annoying me, but bear with me, I guess. So I have some more tips here for poets. Okay, some of these will overlap fiction notes and suggestions, but here are some tips for poets. Always carry a notebook. This should be standard. Now, some of you, if you're like me, you will carry a physical notebook and a pen and all that. Some of you can use your phone. You can type things out to yourself. You can record your voice. You can record. There's actually a voice to text app. I can't remember what it's called, but there's all kinds of technological things we can use in lieu of a notebook. I just like notebooks because I can flip through the pages, I can find my notes easily, and I've got, I don't know, 100 different notebooks lying around. I can see 10 right now on the dining room table that I have commandeered because my wife's not here. So when she gets back, I have to clean this all up. Do not tell her. Anyway, carry a notebook. Write down everything that comes to mind or seems important within reason. This goes back to something that I talked about earlier in don't trust your memory. Okay, if you see something interesting as you're walking around, or you think of something or a question, just write it down. Right now, I don't mean write down what you're thinking about having for lunch, or write down the middle names of all of your friends. You know, that's what I mean is important stuff, okay? Within reason. You're not going to write everything down. I mean, things pertaining to the story, the poem, whatever that you're writing. This next one is actually important for poets because I think that you have to memorize poems as much as you can. Now, some people have better memories than others. This is easier in formal poetry, like verse, that tends to use standardized meter and rhyme. It does help, okay? But you should have, if you want to really kind of get into poetry, I would say about 100 poems memorized. What you'll find, and if you speak other languages, memorize poems in that language. What you'll find is that as you're walking around, right? You're just walking around, and all of a sudden, some aspect in that poem will just jump out to you. It'll be random. It's not that you're thinking about the poem as you're memorizing it. It's later after you've memorized it. And you'll be walking around, and all of a sudden that image or that line or that sound combination or some aspect of it will kind of jump out to you, and that'll be interesting. You'll think, oh, wow, I didn't think about that when I was reading or memorizing the poem. Then you can write it down, right, and make a note. Now that note might lead you to some other similar line or image or whatever in a poem you're writing, okay? So poets have to memorize poems. It makes you more sensitive to sound by learning how other poets manipulate and use it. Another thing, and I tell this to all writers, read things out loud, especially poetry. Poetry is meant usually to be read out loud. But this, once again, lets you kind of almost taste the language. It lets you kind of play around with how poets play with tensions between the written aspect of the poem and its spoken aspects. Okay. Now, this is a more modern convention that has to do with lyric poetry. Epic poetry has a different toolbox than lyric poetry, and especially more modern poetry, because with the convention or with the invention of the printing press, some 400 years ago, give or take, poets and writers now had pages, right, upon which appeared these poems. Before that, it was handwritten manuscripts. So the tedium of handwriting everything, you could look at something like the Book of Kells. That's a work of art in itself, right? But more and more poets tended to see the page as something kind of new and special, and so they began to start playing with how the poem looked on the page rather than just what it was doing inside the words themselves. But Reading things out loud will really help you to see and hear the poems in a different dimension. As Robert Frost said, the ear is the best reader. Should have a period. So this is something that I recommend to all writers. It will help make you more sensitive to language. It's going to be strange at first, but what you have to do is read out loud enough until you can internalize the sound effects orally as you're reading them. Okay, so when I read anything, I am hearing it in my head as if it's being read out loud. Now, sometimes it's less intense. Like I was just reading a book called The Origins of Creativity by E.O. Wilson. Very, very famous biologist. He studies ants. But it's a very good book, and it's not written to be a beautifully written book. It's a very clear, concise book about human evolution. But, so when I read that, I'm not hearing it as loudly in my head as I would if I were reading a poem. Okay? So you can kind of turn that volume down a little bit, but it's a good strategy and skill to have. For poetry, and this is kind of important, for poetry, you're not writing song lyrics, okay? Songs are intended to have accompanying music with them. The accompanying music is part of the song. It's part of how the song is written and produced. Poems have to stand on their own, okay? There's no backing soundtrack. Now, the origins of poetry, where we get, for example, lyric, come from the lyre, which is the old instrument that poets used to use to accompany their lyric poems. This is a different convention because it's much, much, much older, but that's where poetry began. And it began with musical accompaniment. Nowadays, we don't need that. And so a lot of people think that they're writing songs. Now, you can try this example, okay? Take a song you like, go and find the lyrics, and then print them out, and then just read them out loud. What you'll find is that there's actually usually not a lot going on in the song. Most of the song is actually comes from the music inherent to it, okay? So you're not writing song lyrics, you're trying to write poems. The next one goes for any writer at all. Observe the world. Don't just look out at it. You have to actively seek things out in the world that you can kind of grab onto mentally or emotionally to try to use as the basis for the beginning of a poem. Because, and I think this is true, good poems often start with small images, observations, and insights. Then they can swing back out into the universals. You'll see this when I will do another lecture on some specific poems that I think are good examples. And so it's this constant movement from almost like small to large, back to small. And let's say you're walking around and you see a pigeon. You see a pigeon with one foot. Right? Not a huge image. I mean, not an uncommon one. But maybe that image, just that one-footed pigeon, starts making you think of, I don't know, pirates, and you think, oh, he's got a peg leg, and maybe that pigeon has a parrot on his shoulder. I mean, I'm just being silly, but you see that a pigeon standing there with one leg could become a symbol or emblem of empathy, right? Something that we normally wouldn't empathize with. And so you start with a small image, then you move out to a larger, maybe metaphysical conceit of how cruel the world is, even to this nameless, legless bird, etc. Then you move back into some smaller observation. This kind of accordion-like flux is what gives poetry its range. And in fact, if we think back to one of my earlier points, it's what removes poetry from space and time. Because poems can jump from this subject to a completely unrelated subject, line to line or stanza to stanza, and it doesn't sound weird because we're reading a poem, because it's a different type of genre and it uses language in a much different way. Okay. Don't start with themes. Okay. This, like if we think of, here we have our small little pigeon, one-legged, then we move out to how cruel the universe is. That would be more or less a theme. Okay. The uncaring universe, bearing down upon us, death or whatever. If you start with too large a theme, it ideologically drives the poem in a way that I think constrains it. So if I want to, for example, as I write here, my mouse, I want to write a poem about how poverty is bad or love is nice or etc. Okay. Themes will often make your poems too abstract and too artificially broad. Okay. So I usually recommend starting with a small image, something that the reader can mentally grab onto. Then if you want to move out to a larger conceit or theme, that's fine. Because now my brain is kind of locked with the pigeon. So when you move out into the uncaring universe, I'm still thinking pigeon. Okay? But it helps the reader to kind of keep track of where you're moving your metaphors. Another thing, and this should be pretty obvious, but I've seen it fairly often, don't submit first drafts for workshops. When you write a poem or a story, right, and you have your draft there, revise it. Go and read. Revise it. Go and read something else. Revise it. Okay? I want to see at least, second to fourth drafts of things. I know that fiction is going to take a lot longer to revise. I get it. I do it all the time. Okay? But your first drafts are always going to be terrible. They're always going to be terrible. But hopefully we can improve them as we go forward. Okay? I'll say this next thing. I think I mentioned it with fiction. But if you ever intend to publish something, if you try hard at it for long enough and keep practicing and writing and revising and reading, you'll eventually publish something. Right now with the internet as it is, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of places to publish your poetry and fiction, even self-publishing for that matter. You will get hundreds of rejections. I think my first novel was rejected about 100 times until someone said, "Okay, we'll give it a try." I got a lot of compliments. They said it was very well written. They just couldn't market the book. They didn't know where to stick it. Which genre is this in? And I wrote it to avoid genre. I wrote it kind of as a joke to myself. But eventually you'll get published. Take those first 100 rejections as badges of honor. You're trying. You're pushing into a very difficult thing. You're trying to write a good poem or a story. But if you want to publish, just keep trying, and eventually you'll get stuff published. I get rejected all the time, constantly. It's just part of the gig. Now there's these next three bits here are just ways of thinking about poetry. Okay, so I want you to think when you're writing a poem of these three aspects, and these come from Ezra Pound, and he discusses them in an essay. I think it's from his selected essays. He describes this. He says poems have a phanopoesis, a melopoesis, and a logopoesis. Now, these are fancy sounding words that Pound is using, but here we have poesis, so poetry, work. Phano here is the visual aspect. Okay, it comes from this word phanain in the Greek. And what I mean is this. even before we read a poem, now this is modern poetry, okay? If you go back and read Shakespeare, the visual aspects of the poem are way different because he was thinking of the sonnet, for example. He wasn't thinking of the visual qualities of the poem. But if we have the poem, let's say with the title here, and let's say the poem is scattered all around the page. We don't know what the words are yet, but we know that the typographical use here, the visual aspect of the poem, is important for some reason. That's one of the things we have to take into account when we are reading it and interpreting it. What's this poem trying to do? What's this poem? So, if just to give you an example here. Sorry, it's I'm not sure if you can hear that. It's raining right now outside. If the poem is called Autumn, the scattering of the words on the page, right, might be like the scattering of leaves in autumn, etc., depending on where you're from. If you're down in Nassau, a little bit different. If you're where I am here in the Midwest in Iowa, yeah, we get a bunch of dead leaves all over our lawns. The other aspect is the sound of the poem itself. So that comes from, sorry, this word, Fanayin, our word phantom, for example, comes from it. So an apparition, okay, how things appear. Melopoesis, here, melos, our words, melody, mellifluous, come from this word. This is just sound. So that's why we have to read poems out loud until we can internalize them. So we're paying attention to sound. Poets will often play with sound effects to kind of draw attention to certain things. And this is something that you just have to practice, okay? This is not something that you will start doing automatically, but it is an important aspect in poetry, and it's something that we have to, it's a level of the poem that we have to read in order to interpret. Logopoesis is a little bit more clear, comes from this word logos, that's a lambda. Logos means something like 50 or 60 different things in Greek. But here I would say the logopoesis is the overall meaning. If we combine what the words are saying or intending with how they're using sound and how they're using the visual qualities, right? That gives us 1, 2, 3 categories by which we can start to understand what a poem is trying to do, what an author is trying to say. And I think it's just a very useful set of categories for understanding poetry and poetics. Now, with lyric poetry, I would say that there are 2 foundations for lyric poetry. There's the use of line, and then there's the use of image. These will sound very easy when I explain them, but when you actually turn around and try to start doing them in your poems, they're actually really, really kind of hard to get. But if you can get through a class like this and at least start picking up on the use of line and the use of image, you're well on your way to writing good poems, okay? Now, line is something that is very easy to kind of picture in your head. It's just how, if we think of each of these as a sentence, right? So here, for example, we would see that there's the use of punctuation here is usually seems to be more heavily used at the end. Okay, I'll explain what all of these mean here in a moment, but that's all I mean by line. Okay, how is the poet using the line in the poem? We have to think then of the line versus the sentence in the poem. Each new sentence should move to a new focal point, a new idea, a new image. Okay, that'll make the poem nice and jumpy. We want our poems to hint at something and then move. The way I think about it, or the way I usually try to explain it in a class, is since I used to box, if you've ever watched a boxing match, right? Boxers they'll kind of, they're not going to throw a punch every time, right? They're not going to throw a punch every time. What they'll do is they'll shake their shoulder a little bit. They might kind of move their hand a little bit. If you watch a boxer, a good one, they're kind of just constantly just gesturing. And what they're trying to do is to see what their opponent's going to do. If I feint with my left hand, with my jabbing hand, and I see that my opponent's head keeps going right, as if he thinks, oh, I'm going to throw a punch, right? He thinks I'm going to go right, or I'm going to throw that jab, so his head goes right. Well, now if I actually throw a jab, I want to throw it where he keeps moving his head, because I'm kind of tricking him or lulling him with a rhythm, right? I'm tricking him into moving where I want him to move, okay? And this is very common in boxing. So in a poem, it's also kind of nice to feint, right? To give a little gesture, just this little motion, this little thing, okay? It could be an image. It could be a interesting sounding use of language. And then we want to move in for the kill. We want to throw a punch. We want to have a really great image or a really great line, okay? So poems are kind of constantly moving around. They're constantly feinting and jabbing, okay? And so each new sentence, like I said, should move to a new focal point. Now there's three things about line that these are the three main things you really have to get in an intro class. There's what's called an end-stopped line, there's what's called a caesura, and there's what's called an enjambed line or an enjambment. To point these out. End stop. Any line with punctuation at the end of it is an end stopped line. Okay? Any line with punctuation in the middle of it is what we would call a caesura. It comes from the Latin word, I think it's cadere, which means to cut. So it's like the punctuation is kind of cutting up. Here, let me find that. It's like the punctuation is kind of cutting up. Okay, I obliterated my lines. The punctuation is cutting up the line, right? And some authors will do this to give a kind of visual rhythm to the poem. So this would be a caesura, these would all be caesuras, this, and this are end stop. Now notice here, this line and this line have no punctuation at the end of them. That is what we would call an enjambed line. The point of an enjambment, and this is something that I really want you to try to think about as you're writing poetry. The point of an enjambed line, think of a feint. We think the poem is going in this way. There's our feint. A good enjambment tries to surprise the reader right after the non-end stop line. So this enjambment, okay, works in this way. We think the poem is going in this way, and then all of a sudden we get, boom, surprise. So it's just like feint, 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 jab, punch, 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 okay? So that's how an enjambment likes to work. I typed these out, just kind of show you. So if we were going to write out this sentence, don't worry, I don't kiss my cousins. I'm going to try to show you how an enjambment works. One thing you can try doing if you're revising your poems is to put them back into almost like prose form, and then start playing around with breaking these kind of wedge marks. That is that's where like typographically, if I'm doing this, that means break the line here. So if I said, you know, mark, 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 it would be that this would be a line, 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 this would be a line. That would make the poem kind of skinny. Okay, so here's one way we can break this poem up. Luckily, it doesn't erase stuff that I type. So it would look like this. It was Friday, break, when I last kissed, break, my cousin. So we have an enjambed line, enjambed line. Now, not all enjambments are good, okay? Some enjambments are strong, some enjambments are weak, but this enjambment here, because we're not expecting cousin, is much stronger than these, okay? So that's a good enjambment. This is a pretty weak enjambment, but it helps to move the poem. Not every enjambment has to do this, okay? But it's something useful to think about as you're going forward and writing your poems. It was Friday when I last kissed my cousin. We're not expecting cousin. Now, we can rearrange it and we can say, it was Friday, end stop. I kissed my cousin, end stop. Now notice here it has a different phanopoeic aspect, right? We have 3 lines here, we have 2 lines here. We have 2 end stops, right? We could even start to read things into this punctuation. If we had a whole poem, right, about this event that was all end stopped, that could represent shame or guilt or whatever. You know, we could start to read even how the punctuation's being used. Here's another way of breaking that poem around or rewriting it. I kissed my cousin enjambment I kissed my cousin last Friday, or I kissed my cousin when it was Friday. I write these out like this just to kind of show you a small variation. I kissed my cousin last Friday is a weak enjambment. Okay, it's technically an enjambment, that's not end stopped. But last Friday it doesn't really surprise or do anything. So what I did, just as a mental experiment, I rewrote that line to at least make the language a little bit stranger. I kissed my cousin when it was Friday. Now notice here, it conveys the same basic information, right? Same basic information, but when it was Friday, you see how the language is just a little bit off. It seems strange. It's kind of weird, okay? So that use of language actually at least creates a somewhat stronger enjambment for the poem. So sometimes just making your language kind of weird or strange, right, might be enough to save it, might be enough to make it interesting. Now, a couple more important vocabulary pieces you need to know. So we have line and image. I'll get to image here in a minute. We have stanza. Okay, a stanza is basically how the poem is grouped. So you'll see poetry, for example. These are all lines. They'll have these stanzas and then a stanza break. Okay, so you'll have these gaps in between. A stanza tends to be a unit of focus or a unit of attention, okay? Whereas the lines are also units of attention. I have another lecture that I do in my advanced poetics class about how these actually work and how they tie into neuroscience. It's actually kind of interesting. Here it looks like I'm building a snowman now. Ignore the snowman-esque aspects of this. Anyway, so we have couplets. That's where you have 2 lines on the page. Okay. Now think of each of these as a stanza break, if this were all one big poem. So we have a couplet is where you have 2 lines as its own stanza. Stanza actually in Italian means room. If we have 3 lines in our stanza, it's called a tercet. 4 lines is called a quatrain. 5 lines is called a quintain or a cinquain. 6 lines is a sestet. 7 lines is a septet. And 8 lines is an octave. Now, there are, of course, other names for 9, 10, 11, 12, etc. This is all you need to know, okay? These are the ones you need to know. Now, let's say you read a poem, okay, that starts off with a couplet, goes to a tercet, quatrain, etc. The poet is doing something very clearly with their use of stanza lines, okay, with their use of stanzas. If you have 3, 1, 2, 3, here's our stanza breaks. If we have a poem, I don't know, called Faith or whatever, right, and there's all 3, 3, 3, 3, we might think of, well, the use of 3, okay, the tercet here, may be an allusion to something to do with, you know, the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, that sort of thing, okay? If we had 4 in each stanza, if the poet reads in quatrains in a poem called Faith, you know, clearly it's going to change our understanding of how that poet is using the stanzas, okay? We'd have to read the poem and kind of figure out why is he using, or why is she using 4? Why is she using here? So even stanza and line count have meaning in a poem. Okay, stanzas do have meanings. I just wrote this out. I use this example because it's silly. Let's say we were reading a poem called Love. Okay. And we do a phanopoeic reading of it, which is to say we glance at the page and look at how is the poem arranged on the page. And we see couplet, 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 single line. Now, how do we read that poem? We can actually get a reading of the poem without actually reading it. It could almost be like, oh, two people together, oh, until they become one. Oh, right? Do not ever title a poem Love. Do not ever do this. I'm just using this as an example of stanzas, okay? Not as an example of what I think would be a good poem. If we had that same poem structure titled Loss, right? Oh, two people together, oh, and now I'm all alone, right? So you see, we can have the same phanopoeic structure here with very different ways of reading it, okay, depending on titles. I won't say much about titles, except that most of your titles will not survive workshop, okay? I think I mentioned this in one of the fiction lectures. You should always give your poems titles, okay? But especially in poetry, titles are vital. They are super important because they create a lot of tension between, sometimes it's ironic tension, sometimes it's foreshadowing, sometimes it's kind of hard to figure out why the poet titled the poem as they did. But don't title your poems like with these grand metaphysical conceits, okay? Titles are important, put them on your poems, but they are not, they shouldn't be like this. There's a couple more aspects of poetry that you have to understand. These are just good vocabulary bits. If you are an English major, you probably know some of these. If you're not, I want to make sure to cover them. Alliteration. This is the repetition of consonant sounds at the beginning of words in repetition, okay, to kind of draw attention to something. Now, I never want to see a line like this in a poem, okay? This sounds ridiculous, but this is just to show you what alliteration is, okay? The bramble of billowing breezes begets blah, blah, blah. It's almost kind of hard to say out loud. So in that sense, you see, if I read that out loud, maybe the poet is trying to make the poem hard to say out loud. John Keats does this in several of his poems. I think it's, I want to say it's Ode to Autumn. I think it's in that he has a couple lines in there that are virtually impossible to speak out loud because he's describing this really dense garden with all these vines growing all over it. But that's alliteration. Consonance is related to it. This is where you would have repetition at the beginning, end, wherever of a word in repeated. So this is, I'm using consonants with the T here. Okay, try to quote now here that has nothing to do with this sound. Different sound. So even though we're using the same letter, okay, clearly the sound effect is different. Try to quote the best tyrant in the tent. Now, here, certain T's are going to be emphasized, whereas others won't. But you see that consonants kind of just pushes the poem forward. The sound effects nudge the poem forward. Poets do this all the time. And they'll play with sound as a way of creating a kind of internal motion or an internal momentum in the poems. Assonance is like consonants, but with vowels. So, I own 2 moles. I stole the first and was loaned the other. So, okay. Now, here, here, clearly don't sound like o. So, these don't count. That's not assonance, okay? But these hard O sounds, that would be assonance. There's one more in terms of sound. It's called anaphora. This is simply the repetition of lines or phrases at the words or phrases at the beginning of lines. Okay, how I realized, how I saw it, blah 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 blah. How I repeated myself, blah blah blah. Walt Whitman does this a lot because he borrows a lot of his language and the kind of patterns that he writes in from the Bible. Now, image is actually really hard to grab onto at first because trying to think of something here. Okay. An image is where you're using language to create or gesture at a mental picture, something that the reader can see in their minds, okay, in some way that's created out of language. It's actually very tricky to do, even though human beings do this almost without thinking, okay? Because human beings, we are a very visually oriented species. So much of our interpersonal communication comes through facial gestures, body language. We're constantly reading each other's faces. Maybe I mentioned it, maybe not. But so they had some people, I like this experiment. So they had some people watching a screen, okay? And they were just showing a movie or something in it. And they were doing subliminal testing. Now, subliminal testing actually does work. You don't realize, that's why they call it subliminal. So they would show image. So like the movie was running. So this would be the movie, but then they would intersplice in a picture of a human face, right? And so this person couldn't visually see this, but their brain picked up on it. Okay, it was there for a millisecond or whatever, and the person saw it, but didn't realize they were seeing it. They had no conscious knowledge of having seen a smiling face. And all of a sudden, in the brain, right, the regions of the brain that controlled smiling, right, started lighting up. The person didn't start smiling, but their brain was saying, dude, smile, 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 because human beings, when we see each other smile or frown, right, our brains start signaling smile, frown, smile, frown. We can't help it, okay, because our visual our visual sense is so powerful, and we read each other's emotions through each other's faces, right? So then they would do blah, blah, blah. They would show more of the movie. Then they'd show somebody frowning. And the person didn't realize it, but their brain, the areas that control frowning, start firing, and as if to say, hey, come on, frown. Somebody's frowning at you. You have to show. Okay. So imagery in poetry is not that you're drawing pictures in the margins of the text. It's that you are creating language that creates in the reader's mind, right, something of a mental picture. Images are really important. They're actually really hard to get at first. I will point to some imagery in poetry later when I go and look at specific poems. But if we say, here, let's look at this line here. Love hurts. There is no image in this, okay? Because love is a very hard to understand word. It's very metaphysical. Even the word hurts, we all understand what it means to hurt, right? But well, what do you mean? Does love physically hurt, emotionally hurt, mentally hurt? What do you mean? What if we said something like, this? I could have just typed this out. So if we say this, love is a bee's stinger. Now here I'm jamming this, okay? Stuck in the iris of my eye. Now here I'm trying to lean the poem or lean the language toward an image that you can see. And this tends to create a kind of metaphoric resonance. Here there's no metaphor, right? If we said love is a hammered thumb, okay? That's a metaphor. And that, if you smack your thumb with a hammer, we know that it hurts, okay? But hammered thumb, there's an image, okay? So very often imagery will grant or lend the poem a kind of metaphoric resonance that it makes it, first of all, easier to understand, but also more interesting. So we say love is a bee's stinger stuck in the iris of my eye. Notice here that there's a kind of strange lilting to the way that second line works, stuck in the iris of my eye. If this were a formal Now here, I think in is kind of debatable whether or not that gets a hard or soft accent. But if we were doing a formal reading of this, it'd be a trochee, I am, dactyl, and then whatever else. Anyway, so that's all that stuff is metrics, okay? In prosody, we're not going into that. I want you to focus on the image. So we see this now. We see this little bee stinger sticking them in the eyeball, right? So we can kind of see that imagery. And now we know that, well, bee stingers tend to hurt, if they're in your hand. So imagine in the iris of your eye. So now this conveys love hurts, but in a much more interesting way. We have an image, we have a reference to a bee. Why a bee? Well, the rest of the poem might start doing something with this. Maybe it's a nature poem. Maybe it makes allusions to other aspects of nature. We don't know, okay? But maybe love is blind, okay? So if you get stung in the eyeball by a bee, probably you're not going to be able to see very well. So there's all kinds of ways we can go with this. But I want you to think of enjambment, use of line, and imagery as much as you can as you're writing your poems, as you're drafting them, and especially as you're revising them. So that's just a brief intro to some of the aspects of poetry, poetics, And I will turn hopefully soon to some specific poems, and then we'll kind of see how other poets are using line and imagery and metrics and all of that and sound effects in what they're writing. So I hope that helps. Thanks.